master enjoyed a European fame as the leader and glory of German art. In 1515, the emperor allotted him a modest pension of 100 florins a year, or about $2,500. This was irregularly paid, for Maximilian's income never caught up with his plans. When Max died, the pension stopped, and Durer decided to visit the Netherlands and solicit its renewal from Charles V. He took with him a large assortment of drawings and paintings to sell or exchange in Holland or Flanders, and managed thereby to pay nearly all the cost of the trip. The journal that he kept of his tour, from July 1520 to July 1521, is almost, not quite, as intimate as those that Boswell would write 2 centuries later. It records his expenses, sales, purchases, visits, and honors. It reveals the burgher's care with financial details, and the artist's forgivable delight in the recognition of his genius. After chasing Charles through a dozen cities, Durer obtained the renewal of his pension, and could give the rest of his journey to viewing the sights and heroes of the lowlands. He was astonished by the wealth and beauty of Ghent, Brussels, and Bruges, by the great polyptych of the Van Eycks in Saint-Bavance, and by the Antwerp Cathedral, the like of which I have never seen in German lands. He met Erasmus, Lucas van Leyden, Bernard van Orly, and other Netherlands worthies, and was feted in the cities by the artists' guilds. In the mosquito swamps of Zealand he contracted the malaria that ruined the health of his remaining years. One entry in his journal reads, "I have bought Luther's tract for 5 white pennies, and have given one for the condemnation of that mighty man." At Antwerp, in May 1521, a rumor reached him that Luther had been treacherously seized on leaving the Diet of Worms. Durer did not know that this abduction had been arranged to protect the reformer, and fearing that Luther had been killed, he wrote in his journal a passionate defense of the rebel and an appeal to Erasmus to come to the aid of his party. So this man, enlightened by the Holy Ghost to be the continuer of the true faith, has disappeared. If he has suffered, it is for the Christian truth against the unchristian papacy, which works against the freedom of Christ, exacting from us our blood and sweat therewith to nourish itself in idleness, while the peoples famish. O God! Never were men so cruelly put down under human laws as under those of the Roman See. Everyone sees how clear is the doctrine announced in Luther's books, and how it conforms to the Holy Gospel. We must preserve these books from being burned. Rather let us throw into the fire the books written to oppose him. All you pious Christians, deplore with me the loss of this man, and pray the Lord that he will send another guide. O Erasmus of Rotterdam, where wilt thou remain? Wilt thou see the injustice and blind tyranny of the powers now ruling? Hear me, Knight of Christ, ride by the side of our Lord Christ. Old as thou art, thou too mayest win the martyr's crown. Make thy voice heard. O Erasmus, may God thy judge be glorified in thee. When Durer returned to Nuremberg, he devoted himself almost wholly to religious art, and with new emphasis on the Gospels. In 1526 he completed his greatest group of paintings, the 4 Apostles, improperly named since Mark the Evangelist was not one of the 12. But perhaps that very error pointed to the Protestant idea of returning from the Church to the Gospels. The 2 panels are among the proudest possessions of that Haus der Kunst, in which war-wounded Munich has regathered her famous collections of art. One panel pictures John and Peter, the other Mark and Paul, all 4 in gorgeously colored robes, hardly befitting fishermen, communist saints. In these vestments Durer bowed to Italian idealization, while in the broad and massive heads he asserted his German environment. Probably these majestic figures had been intended to form the wings of a triptych for a Catholic church. But in 1525 the Municipal Council of Nuremberg declared for the Reformation. Abandoning the plan for an altarpiece, Durer presented the panels to the city and affixed to each panel inscriptions, strongly stressing the importance of the Gospels. Despite the keys in Peter's hand, usually taken as representing the divine establishment and powers of the Church, these paintings could be interpreted as Durer's Protestant testament. He had now only 2 more years to live. Periodic attacks of malarial fever broke both his health and his spirit. Even in 1522 he had drawn his final self-portrait as the man of sorrows, naked, disheveled, haggard, sickly, in pain, holding in his hands the scourge and whip of the Passion of Christ. Nevertheless, he worked to the end. When he died, on April 6, 1528, aged 57, He left enough drawings, woodcuts, and engravings, besides 6,000 florins, to support his widow in sombre comfort for the remainder of her life. Pirkheimer, who mourned him as the best friend I have had in my life, wrote a simple epitaph for the tomb. Quicquid Alberti dureri mortale, fuit sub hoc conditor tumulo. Whatever was mortal of Albrecht Durer lies under this mound. He missed supreme stature as an artist by sacrificing the greatest task of art to a lesser one. He was so charmed to see the passing shapes of persons, places, and things take lasting life under his hands that he absorbed himself chiefly in representing the real, lovely or ugly, significant or meaningless, and only occasionally fused the scattered elements of sense perception to form in creative imagination, and then in line or color, ideal beauties to give us goals to aim at, or revealing visions to offer understanding or peace. But he rose to the call of his time. He cut into wood or copper a biography of his expectant and generative generation. His pen or pencil, burin or brush, evoked the hidden souls of the forceful men who trod the stage of the age. He made that epic live for us, across 4 centuries, in all its enthusiasms, devotions, fears, superstitions, protests, dreams, and wonderment. He was Germany. 6. The German Humanists. It was a lusty Germany in letters as well as in life and art. Literacy was spreading. Books were pouring forth from 16 publishers in Basel, 20 in Augsburg, 21 in Cologne, 24 in Nuremberg. There Anton Koberger alone employed 24 presses and 100 men. The trade in books was a major line in the busy commerce of the fairs at Frankfurt, Salzburg, Nördlingen, and Ulm. "Everybody nowadays wants to read and write," said a contemporary German, and another reported, "There is no end to the new books that are written." Schools multiplied in the towns. Every city provided bursaries or scholarships for poor but able students. 9 new universities were founded in this half-century, and those at Vienna, Heidelberg, and Erfurt opened their doors to the new learning. Literary academies arose in Strasbourg, Augsburg, Basel, Vienna, Nuremberg, and Mainz. Rich burghers like Peutinger and Pirkheimer and the Emperor Maximilian himself opened their libraries, art collections, and purses to eager scholars. And great ecclesiastics like Johann von Dalberg, Bishop of Worms, and Albrecht of Brandenburg, Archbishop of Mainz, were enlightened patrons of scholarship, poetry, and art. The Church in Germany, following the lead of the popes, welcomed the Renaissance, but emphasized linguistic studies of biblical and patristic texts. The Latin Vulgate Bible was printed in 26 editions in Germany between 1453 and 1500. There were 20 German translations of the Bible before Luther's. The spread of the New Testament among the people prepared them for Luther's challenging contrast between the Gospels and the Church, and the reading of the Old Testament shared in the Protestant re-Judaizing of Christianity. The humanist movement in Germany was at first, and after its flirtation with Luther, more orthodox in theology than its Italian counterpart. Germany had no classical past like Italy's. She had not the privilege of being conquered and educated by imperial Rome. She had no direct bond with non-Christian antiquity. Her memory hardly went beyond her Christian centuries. Her scholarship in this age hardly ventured beyond the Christian fathers. Her Renaissance was a revival of early Christianity rather than of classic letters and philosophy. In Germany, the Renaissance was engulfed in the Reformation. Nevertheless, German humanism took its lead from Italy. Poggio Bracciolini, Aeneas Sylvius, and other humanists visiting Germany brought the seed. German students, pilgrims, ecclesiastics, merchants, and diplomats visiting Italy came back bearing on them, even unwittingly, the pollen of the Renaissance. Rodolphus Agricola, son of a Dutch parish priest, received plentiful schooling at Erfurt, Cologne, and Louvain, gave 7 years to further studies of Latin and Greek in Italy, and returned to teach at Groningen, Heidelberg, and Worms. The age marveled at his unpopular virtues, modesty, simplicity, honesty, piety, chastity. He wrote in a Latin almost worthy of Cicero. He predicted that Germany would soon appear no less Latin than Latium, and indeed, in the next generation, Agricola's Holland produced in Erasmus a Latinist who would have been quite at home in the Rome of Tacitus and Quintilian. It was on a trip to Rome that Agricola contracted the fever from which he died at Heidelberg at the age of 42 in 1485. He was rivaled in influence, hardly in amiability, by Jacob Wimpfeling, whose temper was as harsh as his Latin was smooth. Resolved to lift Germany to Italy's level in education and letters, this schoolmaster of Germany drew up plans for a system of public schools, established learned societies, and yet foresaw how dangerous intellectual advance would be without moral development. "What profits all our learning," he asked, "if our characters be not correspondingly noble, or all our industry without piety, or all our knowledge without love of our neighbor, or all our wisdom without humility?" The last of these orthodox humanists was Johannes Trithemius, abbot of Sponheim, who nevertheless wrote in 1496, "The days of building monasteries are past, the days of their destruction are coming." A less devout humanist, Celtis, described Trithemius as abstemious in drink, disdaining animal food, living on vegetables, eggs, and milk, as did our ancestors when no doctors had begun to brew their gout and fever-breeding concoctions. In his brief life he became a very summa of learning, skilled in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and their literatures, and carrying on a correspondence with Erasmus, Maximilian, imperial electors, and other celebrities. The common people of the time could only explain his attainments on the theory that he possessed secret supernatural powers. However, he died at 54 in 1516. Conrad Celtis was the most zealous and effective of the German humanists, passing like some hurried diplomat of letters from city to city, studying in Italy, Poland, and Hungary, teaching in Cologne, Heidelberg, Krakow, Prague, Mainz, Vienna, Ingolstadt, Padua, Nuremberg. He unearthed precious forgotten manuscripts like the plays of Roswitha, and ancient maps like that which he gave to Peutinger, whose name it came to bear. Wherever he went he gathered students about him, inspired them with his passion for poetry, classical literature, and German antiquities. In 1447 at Nuremberg, the Emperor Frederick III crowned him Poet Laureate of Germany. At Mainz, Celtis founded in 1491 the influential Rhenish Literary Society, which included scientists, theologians, philosophers, physicians, historians, poets, such lawyers as the distinguished jurist Ulrich von Hutten, and such scholars as Pirkheimer, Trithemius, Reuchlin, and Wimpfeling. At Vienna, with funds provided by Maximilian, he organized in 1501 an Academy of Poetry, which became an honored part of the university, and in which teachers and pupils lived together in the same house and enterprise. In the course of his studies, Celtis apparently lost his religious faith. He raised such questions as, will the soul live after death, and is there really a God? In his travels he took many samples of femininity, but none to the altar, and he concluded light-heartedly that there is nothing sweeter under the sun to banish care than a pretty maid in a man's arms. This skeptical amoralism grew in fashion among the German humanists in the final decades before Luther. Urban Hesse wrote in good Latin Heroides Christianiae in 1514, which imitated Ovid even more in scandal than in form. He included love letters from Magdalene to Jesus and from the Virgin Mary to God the Father. To suit the deed to the word, he lived as loosely as Cellini, outdrank all rivals, and thought nothing of emptying a bucket of ale at one draught. Conradus Mucianus Rufus, however, achieved an amiable reconciliation of skepticism with religion. After studying at Deventer, at Erfurt, and in Italy, he contented himself with a modest canonry at Gotha, put over his door the motto Beata Tranquillitas, collected admiring students, and taught them to esteem the decrees of philosophers above those of priests. But, he warned them, they must conceal their doubts of Christian dogma from the multitude by a gentlemanly adherence to ecclesiastical ceremonies and forms. By faith, he said, we mean not the conformity of what we say with fact, but an opinion about divine things founded upon credulity and profit-seeking persuasion. He objected to masses for the dead as useless, to fasts as unpleasant, and to auricular confession as embarrassing. The Bible, he thought, contains many fables, like those of Jonah and Job. Probably Christ had not really died on the cross. The Greeks and the Romans, so far as they lived honorably, were Christians without knowing it, and doubtless went to paradise. Creeds and ceremonies are to be judged not on their literal claims, but by their moral effects. If they promote social order and private virtue, they should be accepted without public questioning. Mucianus demanded a clean life from his disciples, and in his later years he vowed, I will turn my studies to piety and will learn nothing from poets, philosophers, or historians save what can promote a Christian life. Having lived with all the consolations of philosophy, he died with all the blessings of the Church in 1526. The natural resentment aroused among the orthodox by the skepticism of the later humanists fell in accumulation upon the mildest and kindliest scholar of the time. Johannes Reuchlin observed the medieval tradition of gathering education from a dozen centers through the ubiquity of Latin as the language of instruction in Western Europe. In the grammar school of his native Pforzheim, in the universities of Freiburg, Paris, Basel, Orléans, and Poitiers, in Linz, Milan, Florence, and Rome, he pursued with almost fanatical ardor the study of Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and law. Following the custom of the German humanists, he changed his name, which he derived from rauchen, to smoke, to kapnio, kapnos, from Greek for smoke. At 20, he compiled a Latin dictionary, which went through several editions. At Rome, Johannes Argyropoulos gave him a difficult passage in Thucydides to translate. Reuchlin responded so readily that the old Greek exclaimed, "Greece has now fled beyond the Alps." The avid student let no rabbi pass without learning some Hebrew from him. Eusebius claimed to have heard of Reuchlin giving a Jewish scholar 10 gold pieces for explaining one Hebrew phrase. But this may have been a humanist's dream. Pico della Mirandola persuaded Reuchlin to seek wisdom in the Kabbalah. Comparing Jerome's translation of the Old Testament with the original Hebrew text, Kapnio pointed out many errors in what theologians habitually quoted as an infallible document. At 38, in 1493, he was appointed professor of Hebrew in the University of Heidelberg. The Hebrew dictionary and grammar that he composed put the study of Hebrew and of the Old Testament on a scientific basis and contributed to the powerful influence of the Hebrew Scriptures on Protestant thought. Gradually, his admiration for Hebrew eclipsed his devotion to the classics. "The Hebrew language," he wrote, "is unadulterated, concise, and brief. It is the language in which God spoke to man, and in which man conversed with the angels face to face." Through all his studies, he retained the Orthodox faith. He muddied it a bit with mysticism, but he devoutly submitted all his writings and teachings to the authority of the Church. A strange medley of circumstances made him the hero of the German Renaissance. In 1508, Johannes Pfefferkorn, a rabbi-turned-priest, issued a book, Judenspiegel, Mirror of the Jews, condemning persecution of the Jews and clearing them from legendary crimes popularly laid to their charge, but urging them to give up money-lending and the Talmud and accept Christianity. Supported by the Dominicans of Cologne, he submitted to the emperor a recommendation that all Hebrew books except the Old Testament should be suppressed. Maximilian ordered that all Jewish literature critical of Christianity should be surrendered to Pfefferkorn, and that it should be examined by the universities of Cologne, Erfurt, Mainz, and Heidelberg, by Jakob von Hoogstraten, head of the Inquisition at Cologne, and by Reuchlin because of his fame for Hebrew learning. All but Reuchlin advised that the books should be confiscated and burned. Reuchlin's minority opinion proved a landmark in the history of religious toleration. He divided Jewish books into 7 classes. One group, consisting of works expressly mocking Christianity, should be burned. All the rest, including the Talmud, should be preserved, if only because they contained much of value to Christian scholarship. Moreover, he argued, the Jews had a right to freedom of conscience, both as citizens of the empire and as having undertaken no obligations to Christianity. In private correspondence, Reuchlin spoke of Pfefferkorn as an ass who had no real understanding of the books he proposed to destroy. Pfefferkorn responded to these courtesies in a Handspiegel, or hand mirror, that attacked Reuchlin as a bribed tool of the Jews. Reuchlin retorted in the same vituperative vein in an Augenspiegel, or eyeglass, that aroused a storm among the Orthodox. The theological faculty at Cologne complained to Reuchlin that his book was making the Jews too happy, and they urged him to withdraw it from circulation. Maximilian forbade its sale. Reuchlin appealed to Leo X. The Pope turned the matter over to various counselors who reported that the book was harmless. Leo suspended action, but assured the humanists around him that no harm should come to Reuchlin. Meanwhile, Pfefferkorn and his Dominican supporters accused Reuchlin before the tribunal of the Inquisition at Cologne as an unbeliever and a traitor to Christianity. The archbishop interposed and remitted the case to Rome, which passed it on to the episcopal court of Speyer, which acquitted Reuchlin. The Dominicans in their turn appealed to Rome, and the university faculties of Cologne, Erfurt, Mainz, Louvain, and Paris ordered Reuchlin's books to be burned. It is remarkable, and eloquent of Germany's cultural vitality in this age, how many notables now came to Reuchlin's defense. Erasmus, Pirkheimer, Peutinger, Ecolampadius of Basel, Bishop Fischer of Rochester, Ulrich von Hutten, Mucianus, Euben Hesse, Luther, Melanchthon, even some of the higher clergy who, as in Italy, favored the Humanists. Imperial electors, princes in 53 cities proclaimed their support of Reuchlin. Letters from his defenders were collected and published in 1514 as Clarorum Virorum Epistolae ad Johannem Reuchlin. In 1505, the Humanists sent forth a more devastating book, Epistolae Obscurorum Virorum ad Venerabilem Virum Magistrum Ortuinum Gratium, Letters of Obscure Men to the Venerable Master Ortuinus Gratius, Professor of Literature in Cologne. This is one of the major satires in literary history. It succeeded so well that an enlarged edition was published in 1516, and a continuation a year later. The authors pretended to be pious monks, admirers of Gratius and enemies of Reuchlin, and concealed themselves under grotesque pseudonyms. Nicolaus Capramulgius, or goat-milker, Johannes Pelifex, or skin-maker, Simon Wurst, or sausage, Conradus Unkebunk. In Latin made deliberately bad to imitate the monastic style, the writers complained of the ridicule heaped upon them by the poets, as the German humanists were called. They inquired eagerly about the prosecution of Reuchlin. Meanwhile, they exposed their absurd ignorance, the grossness of their morals and their minds. They argued ridiculous questions in solemn scholastic form, quoted scripture in extenuation of obscenities, and unwittingly made fun of auricular confession, the sale of indulgences, the worship of relics, the authority of the Pope, the very themes of the Reformation. All literate Germany puzzled over the authorship of the volumes. Only later was it admitted that Crotus Rubianus of Erfurt, a disciple of Mucianus, had written most of the first edition, and Hutten most of the continuation. Roused to anger, Leo X forbade the reading or possession of the book, condemned Reuchlin, but let him off with the costs of the Speyer trial in 1520. Reuchlin, 65 and exhausted, retired into obscurity, peacefully lost in the glare of the Reform. The German humanist movement, too, disappeared in that conflagration. On one side it was fought by most of the universities. On the other, the reformers, engaged in a struggle for life, strengthened their cause with a religious faith that centered on personal salvation in the other world, and left little time for studies of classical civilization or of human amelioration here below. The German humanists themselves invited defeat by failing to advance from Greek literature to Greek philosophy, by wandering into coarse polemics or a mysticism far less mature than Eckhart's. They left no major works. The grammars and dictionaries that Reuchlin hoped would be his monument more lasting than brass were soon superseded and forgotten. And yet who knows if Luther would have dared sling his David shots at Tetzel and the popes if the mind of Germany had not been in a measure freed from the ultramontane errors by the humanists. The followers of Reuchlin and Mucianus were a vigorous minority at Erfurt, where Luther studied for 4 years, and the greatest German poet of the age, nurtured in humanism, became the ardent herald of the Reformation. 7. Ulrich von Hutten. There were no giants in the German literature of this age before Luther. There was only an amazing effervescence and fertility. Poetry was written to be read aloud, and was therefore welcomed in cottage and palace. Mystery and passion plays continued to be acted, overlaying a rough piety with a strong interest in dramatic art. By 1450, the German popular drama was largely secularized. It included, even in the course of religious plays, crude and sometimes scandalous farces. Humor frolicked in the literature. Now the vicissitudes and drolleries of Till Eulenspiegel, that wandering trickster, literally owl-glass, romped through Germany, his merry pranks sparing neither layman nor priest. And in 1515 his adventures took printed form. Time and again the literature, as well as the art, showed monks and priests being dragged down to hell. Satire flourished in every literary form. The most effective satire of the time was the Narrenschiff, or Ship of Fools, of Sebastian Brandt, from 1494. No one could have expected so lively a performance from a professor of law and classical literature at Basel. Brandt imagined a fleet, he forgot it en voyage and later called it a ship, manned by fools and trying to navigate the sea of life. One fool after another struts the scene. One class after another bears the whip of the jurist's angry doggerel. Peasant, mechanic, beggar, gambler, miser, usurer, astrologer, lawyer, pedant, fop, philosopher, priest. The vanity of ambitious men, the idleness of students, the venality of tradesmen, the dishonesty of journeymen, all get their share of the blows, and Brant reserves his respect only for the pious and orthodox Catholic who ordains his life so as to gain paradise. Beautifully printed and adorned with woodcuts that point at each barb of the tale, the book sailed to triumph everywhere in Western Europe, through a dozen translations. Next to the Bible, it was the most widely read book of the time. Brant laid his lash tenderly upon the clergy, but Thomas Murner, a Franciscan friar, attacked monks and priests, bishops and nuns, with satires at once sharper, coarser, and wittier than Brant's. The priest, said Murner, is interested in money more than in religion. He coaxes every possible penny from his parishioners, then pays part of his gleanings to his bishop for permission to keep a concubine. Nuns make love clandestinely, and the one who has the most children is chosen abbess. Murner, however, agreed with Brant in fidelity to the Church. He denounced Luther as one more fool, and in a touching poem, Von dem Untergang des christlichen Glaubens, he mourned the decline of Christian belief and the deepening chaos of the religious world. If the immense popularity of these satires revealed the scorn in which even loyal Catholics held their clergy, the still more passionate satires of Ulrich von Hutten abandoned all hope for the self-reform of the Church and called for open revolt. Born of a knightly family in Franconia, Ulrich was sent at 11 to the monastery of Fulda with the expectation that he would become a monk. After 6 years of probation, he fled in 1505 and led the life of a wandering student, composing and reciting poetry, begging his way and often shelterless, but finding means to make love to a lass who left her signature in his blood. His small body was almost consumed with fever. His left leg was often made useless by ulcers and swellings. His temper took on the irritability of an invalid, but Urban Hesse found him altogether lovable. A kindly bishop took him to Vienna, where the humanists welcomed him, but he quarreled with them and moved on to Italy. He studied at Pavia and Bologna, shot poisoned epigrams at Pope Julius II, joined an invading German army in order to eat, and then, always in pain, made his way back to Germany. At Mainz, fortune gave him a passing smile. He wrote a panegyric on young Archbishop Albrecht and received 200 guilders, or about $5,000, in acknowledgment. Albrecht's court was now a very hive of humanists, many of them irreverent freethinkers. There Hutten began his contribution to the Epistolae Obscurorum Virorum. There he met Erasmus and was captivated by the great scholar's learning, wit, and charm. With Albrecht's guilders and aid from his relenting father, he again sought the sun of Italy, blasting at every stop the hypocritical, corrupt race of theologians and monks. From the papal capital he sent a warning to Crotus Rubianus. "Renounce your desire to see Rome, my friend. What you seek there is not to be found there any longer. You may live from plunder, commit murder and sacrilege. You may revel in lust and deny God in heaven. But if you do but bring money to Rome, you are a most respectable person. Virtue and heavenly blessings are sold here. You may even buy the privilege of sinning in future. You would then be crazy to be good. Sensible folk will be wicked." With gay irony, he dedicated to Leo X in 1517 a new edition of Valla's devastating treatise on the fictitious donation of Constantine, and assured the Pope that most of his papal predecessors had been tyrants, robbers, and extortioners, who had turned the punishments of the next world into revenue for themselves. This work came into Luther's hands and warmed his ire against the papacy. Despite the vituperative violence of many of Hutten's poems, they won him a scattered fame in Germany. Repatriating himself in 1517, he was entertained at Nuremberg by Conrad Peutinger, and at this rich scholar's suggestion Maximilian crowned Hutten poet laureate. Albrecht now took him into his diplomatic service and sent him on important missions as far afield as Paris. When Hutten returned to Mainz in 1518, he found Germany agitated by Luther's theses on indulgences, and he must have smiled to see his own easygoing archbishop uncomfortably involved. Luther was being summoned to Augsburg to face Cardinal Cajetan and a charge of heresy. Hutten hesitated. He was attached to the archbishop emotionally and financially, but he felt in his blood the call to war. He mounted his horse and rode off to Augsburg. 8. The German Church. What actually was the condition of the German Church in the youth of Luther? This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.